concluding chapter of Ulysses is a monologue, a soliloquy by Molly Bloom, Leopold Bloom's wife, that is written in a stream of consciousness style, kind of the way one idea connects to another and flits to another. This is Joyce's way of trying to represent the stream of consciousness of one of his characters. And in fact, returning to Lodge's Thinks, you can see examples that are kind of modeled on Molly Bloom's soliloquy in Thinks, a point I'll talk about in a second. To take another the famous early 20th century novel, Mrs. Dalloway. Many of you have seen the movie. Again, this is written all from the point of view of the subjective interior life of the characters as Mrs. Dalloway goes on throughout the day making preparations for a party. And there are all these characters in Mrs. Dalloway, her old friend Peter Walsh and all of that. And one of the things Woolf does is unexpectedly, without any kind of warning, switches the narrative from one character's interior life to another character's interior life. So we have to be able to follow this. This is Septimus thinking now, not Clarissa Dalloway or whatever. And it's here that you're getting 6 or 7 different levels of intentionality in the book, because at one point you have Clarissa thinking about what Septimus is thinking about Richard and all of that. Again, nice Christmas reading if you want to do it. Here's another literary example of consciousness in Swan's Way, in lots of the first volume of the Remembrance of Things Past, where the Marcel dips the Madeline in some tea, and all of a sudden he experiences a rush of involuntary memory, and he remembers a similar episode that happened when he was a child back in the family farmhouse in Cambrai. So there's another example. One final example of a literary depiction of consciousness, a later work by James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, which most people, including myself, find pretty hard slogging to read. But it turns out that Finnegan's Wake is really a literary attempt to depict what somebody's dream life is like. And to make things even more interesting, what Joyce does in Finnegan's Wake is to blend together the dream lives of a number of different people. So in much the same way as Virginia Woolf has us going through the conscious mental states of a number of different people at the same time, Joyce has us going through the unconscious, if you will, the mental states. The book is full of puns and loose associations and all sorts of things like that. Begins puzzlingly in the middle of a sentence: river run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. You kind of wonder where that comes from until you get to the end of the book, okay? And you see there's the keys to, given, away, alone, alas, the loved, along the, and that sentence ends. But it turns out that this sentence connects to the first sentence of Finnegan's Wake. Away, alone, alas, the loved, along the river run, past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, blah, 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 okay? The whole thing is like a Mobius strip or something like that that connects from beginning to end. So again, what Lodge is trying to do and thinks is to get us to think about these issues and to think about how literary depictions of consciousness connect to scientific descriptions of consciousness. Think about the structure of Thinks for a second. This is the structure of Thinks. You've basically got 3 things going on here. There are 2 first-person narratives here. You get Ralph's and Helen's. Ralph is speaking into his tape recorder, and Helen is writing in her diary. And then you get a narrator who's giving us a third-person perspective. So you got these two first-person perspectives and a third-person perspective, essentially alternating chapters. Ralph, talking into his tape recorder, is giving us a kind of parody or maybe a satire of Molly Bloom's soliloquy in Ulysses. His ideas flitting from one thing to another, not very well formed, not particularly grammatical, not particularly logical. He's not maintaining a consistent stream of thought. Helen, writing, in her diary, is giving us a much more coherent representation of what she's thinking and how she reacted to the various events of the day. And then you get this omniscient narrator who knows what Ralph is doing, what he's thinking, what Helen is thinking, and what all the other characters are thinking as well. And just point out here, for those of you who haven't read it yet, which I encourage you to do, Chapter 8 is directly inspired by Thomas Nagel's essay on what is it like to be a bat. Helen assigns her writing seminar students the task of setting down in paper what it's like to be a bat. And then there's another writing assignment in Helen's classes about Mary, the color scientist, which you'll remember from early on. And again, she's asking her class to kind of figure out what a solution to Mary the color scientist problem might be. So again, that's kind of what's going on here. And again, Lodge is trying to illustrate the different ways in which literature grapples with the same problem that Ralph is trying to grapple with. How is it that we can get a description of consciousness? Along the way, Lodge touches on almost all the major topics in this course. It's just kind of quite amazing. It's not a summary of the course, and there are some things he leaves out, but this is just what I could fit readably on a single PowerPoint slide of the various kinds of topics that we've touched on in this course that Lodge or one of his characters has something to say about. Even Ralph's center, the Holt-Belling Center for Cognitive Science, has its real-life counterpart. This is the Sackler Center for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex. Yeah, it doesn't exactly look like Lodge's description of the Holt-Belling, but there is actually somewhere. This is the only one I know about that's a physical building devoted to consciousness science in the same way that the Holt-Belling Center is supposed to be. And you remember that even some of the architectural features of the Holt-Belling Center are related to the various aspects of consciousness science. There's a dome over the Holt-Belling Center, not unlike the one at the Sackler Center, but it's divided into two, representing the two hemispheres of the brain. The walls of the center are made of mirror glass, which Lodge describes as somehow related to the transparency of science, but I think also bring to mind the mirror test of self-image. There's a staircase running through the Holt-Belling Center that has a left-handed spiral like DNA. And then there's the Corinthian mural, which represents in imagistic form, again, various themes that characterize modern consciousness science and topics that we've talked about in the class. I don't know whether the Sackler Center for Consciousness Studies has anything like the Corinthian mural or not. I do know that a student who took this class a couple of years ago made one. This is work by Olga Timofeyeva, who's a postdoc at UC San Francisco. She's a genetic neuroscientist who, after doing the graduate version of this course, she's quite an accomplished artist, went home and made her own version of the Corinthian mural. So we could kind of get some sense of what the Corinthi mural might have looked like. So, you know, if you're good at art, you can try one of these for yourself. Okay, so there are lots of ways in which, at least with respect to literature, the arts and humanities can connect up and do connect up, as Lodge would argue, and as Zunschein and Dunbar argue as well, with the science that people are the people are trying to do when they're trying to study consciousness scientifically, but not just in literature. There are also artistic trends that relate one way or another to the study of consciousness. Perhaps the most obvious is the 19th century artistic movement known as Impressionism. Before about 1860 or so, this is what art was supposed to look like. This is the death of Leonardo da Vinci by Ong. It's supposed to be a realistic depiction of some kind of scene. Monet and the other Impressionists were going to have none of that, and instead, what they wanted to try to depict in their art is what the momentary conscious experience of a scene would look like, and this is Monet's Impression Sunrise, the first painting of this movement. And it turns out that the Impressionists were very much influenced by 19th century psychology, 19th century psychophysics, 19th century analyses of sensation and perception. No better example of this is in the pointillistic work of Georges Seurat. This is his famous painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. Anybody ever been to Chicago? It's hanging at the top of the stairway as you go into the Art Institute of Chicago. It's this thing that just hits you right in the face. It's this amazing painting. But what's interesting about it was Seurat, when he was painting, had actually read the work of Jung and Helmholtz and others on color theory. And he understood, whereas previous painters mixed their paints on the palette or on the canvas, that really what's important about the perception of art is what goes on in the eye. So what the Seurat does is to apply basically primary colors in very, very, very small dots, each one discrete. The closer you get to the painting, when you go to the Art Institute of Chicago, the clearer it becomes exactly what his technique has been. And just to make sure that everybody gets it, what Seurat did was to frame the painting by individual applications of these dots, so you can see exactly what his technique was. But his general idea was, again, that the painting technique is predicated on what we know about qualia and the perception of color. A lot of Seurat's work, and for that matter, other Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were doing very much the same thing. And like the other Impressionists, what Seurat is trying to do is not paint things the way they are. Things are not bunches of little dots, right? Unless I suppose you're a subatomic particle physicist or something. But rather the way people experience the perception and reality. Here's another example from the 20th century, abstract expressionism. This is the work of Jackson Pollock, his famous painting 1, number 31. It's kind of